many years to follow, to practice what they preach, to follow particularly the model of partnering with local organizations in a way that allows them to lead from the start. Peace Direct does not have country offices. They support their peace building and other colleagues in ways that I think will be showcased in Dylan's comments as well on the 9 roles that NGOs can play. Dylan, I don't want to hold too much time in the intro, so I'll pass it on to you, and glad to have you here. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Isabella, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here again, and great to see so many people online. So I'm going to share my screen. As Isabella said, I'm going to just talk you through this particular report and why we wrote it, and then go through those 9 roles. A lot of it is what you will have read in the report if you have had the chance to read the report, but if not, this is a sort of a whistle-stop tour of that report, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So just going to share my screen now, and if someone could just let me know if you can actually see if you can see it. Yeah, very good.
We can see it, Dylan. You can maybe make it larger. Yes, perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay, so this conversation we're going to have is about the role of INGOs in a reimagined sector. And of course, there is no better time, I think, to be talking about this as we look at our sector, and our sector is in crisis for lots of reasons, not just a crisis, I think, of legitimacy that's come over the last however many years as a result of questions around structural and systemic racism and sort of neo-colonial attitudes and practices, but also a funding crisis that we all know about too well, which is has prompted some very big soul searching, I think, in the sector. So this, I wondered whether this presentation was coming at a very good time or a very bad time, and maybe it is just a moment where we can reflect on our roles as INGOs. Just quickly, for those of you who weren't in the last presentation, so some of you will have been in the last presentation, the learning session that Isabella mentioned, but so you will have seen this, but if you weren't in that, just a quick note about Peace Direct. So we are just over 20 years old. We've always had this strong sense that we want to shift power and resources to local actors. As Isabella mentioned, we don't have country offices. We don't have expat staff. We've always been in service of local actors and always wanted to try and shift power and resources to local actors. And we've had sort of 25 years of experience of doing that. We've been analysing the dysfunctions in the sector for some time whilst being part of the sector. I mean, we are an INGO based in London, a Global North INGO, but we also recognise there are dysfunctions in our sector. And by sector, I mean not just peace building, I mean the wider peace building, humanitarian and development sector, anything that we would call international cooperation between Global North and Global South actors. And one of the things that we've noticed is over those last 20 years in trying to shift power and resources to local actors, we've noticed 3 things and 3, I guess, barriers to change when it comes to INGOs. One of which is that they've been very, very slow to acknowledge the problems of structural and systemic racism and their own neo-colonial attitudes. Some of you will have heard me talk about this before, and it's very widely discussed now, which is a good thing. But that's been a very slow acknowledgement of the problems there. The second is not very well understood, and I really want to just emphasize this, that, you know, INGOs, in growing their role and reach, they have suppressed the growth of local and indigenous civil society. So when you look at INGOs, and if you look at the growth of INGOs in most countries in the global south or majority world, they've grown exponentially. And actually, a piece of research that we conducted for the Shift the Power movement showed that 93% of all the funding globally for civil society goes to INGOs. Very little of it goes directly to local organizations. So INGOs are soaking up the vast majority of the funding that's available for civil society. And then the third reason why the system isn't changing is that actually there's a failure of imagination. We don't know as INGOs what role we should have for ourselves if we don't do direct implementation. So those together create a bit of a perfect storm when it comes to the system and the sector not transforming. And that's what we wanted to talk about and discuss today. Before I do that, I just want to give you some background. So we've been hosting global consultations with local actors now for almost 5 years. and have consulted well over 700 local actors from around the world, probably close to 1,000 now. We've encouraged them to talk about the dysfunctions that they see, the problems, how INGOs show up in these spaces, but also we've encouraged them to think about, what does a reimagined sector look like? What does a manifesto for what a sector transformation should look like? And so for those of you who haven't seen them, I'd encourage you to have a look at these reports. The middle one we're going to talk about today, but there are two others: Time to Decolonize Aid in earlier on in this period, so in 2021, and then Transforming Partnerships, which is the subject of the presentation I gave a couple of months ago to the pledge community. So we're going to look at the 9 roles. And just to explain how this paper emerged, this paper was not only based on just our reflections on the conversations that we've had over the last 5 years with local organizations, but it was also a reflection of our own practice and our discussions that we had with our own partners. So we have partners in 14 countries. In some of those countries, we've been supporting local organizations for close to 20 years. So this is very much about building on what we have done, and our experience, and also what local partners have actually said they value about us. And we felt that it was useful enough, and there were some interesting insights in there to share and then put into a report. So these are the 9 roles. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one very, very quickly and hopefully then get into a conversation. I should also mention that they're in no particular order. So the first isn't the most important. It was the way in which they were shared with us from our partners. So don't take number 1 as being the most important one. They're all, I would say, not quite equally important. Some probably more important than others, but there's no ranking here. So the first one is interpreter. We know, because I've been in the sector since the late 90s, and I'm sure for as long as you've been in the sector, our sector loves its jargon. We love our acronyms, and they are impenetrable to local partners. They're impenetrable to local actors. And what we found is that creates a huge knowledge and information gap between Global North organizations and Global South. And we've got to figure out how to break that knowledge gap, because that means that local actors who should be participating in conversations aren't participating in those conversations. And it's not simply a case of language justice, as they would say. So it's not just a case of translating and interpreting from English to Spanish or English to Swahili or English to Arabic or whatever it might be. It's also about actually making sense of documents that are very, very difficult to read. A practical example would be UN documents, UN statements and UN pledges are often not then translated into other languages, but also they are just not made accessible. So just helping bridge that knowledge gap is really, really important. And when we've done that at Peace Direct, we found that partners not only are excited by the prospect of what they're hearing, but they also want to actively engage in those conversations. So suddenly a barrier has been removed and they can start talking about and engaging in those conversations. So a question for you all, particularly those of you who work for INGOs, is, what information is useful for your partners, which is currently inaccessible? So what role can you play in making that information accessible to your partners and to local organizations and also local communities? So interpreter is the first one. The second, which is very much linked to the first, is knowledge broker and producer. So the idea here was that, we all know there's a wealth of knowledge out there. In fact, there's a lot of knowledge, from other local actors across the majority world or Global South. What we know also is that when we speak to our partners, that they just don't have the time to locate that knowledge. Sometimes that's about internet access and just having the time. So sometimes it's just about time scarcity. They are busy doing their work. They don't often have the opportunity and the luxury to be able to sit and do lots of research around the knowledge that might actually help them. And actually what INGOs can do is bridge that gap. And that gap is not about bridging the gap specifically between, the Global North knowledge that is being produced and then giving it to the Global South, because that's very neo-colonial in its structuring. Actually, what we have noticed is that the best knowledge comes from other Global South actors who can support their peers, their comrades in other parts of the world. So we can be a really helpful broker of that knowledge. Of course, there's another thing that we can do, and we do that already. I imagine everyone on this call does, which is that we also produce and share knowledge. So we can continue to do that because we hear from our partners that they still value that. I think if someone could just mute the microphone, because I think some of the microphones are unmuted right now. There's a question I would ask you all is, how can you identify the knowledge from your partners and from other Global South actors to help them learn from each other? Now, you'll see in this slide that there are 3 asterisks on that 4th bullet point, and that's a health warning. So every time you see one of those asterisks, I'm saying to you, we've got to be careful, tread carefully, because the way in which we produce knowledge reinforces the divisions between the global north and the global south and is part of the problem. So particularly INGOs who hold themselves up as the self-appointed experts of other people's lives, that actually we've got to be really, really careful when we talk about sharing and producing knowledge, that we're not reinforcing existing inequitable relationships and unequal power relations by saying that we have more knowledge than them or we know more than them. So we've got to be really, really careful with that. The third is trainer, coach, and co-learner. Now, when we talk to local actors around the world, and particularly in our global consultations, lots of local actors have said they're very, very critical of this whole concept of capacity building. They say, you don't value our knowledge, is what we hear a lot. We don't value their expertise. But they also say that actually they want to learn, as we all should do, right? We're all committed to learning. So how can we be a sensitive trainer and coach if we have something that we can share, knowledge that we can share? Again, there's those 3 asterisks there, because I think that there's an overemphasis on the knowledge that INGOs have. And a lot of INGOs tend to start with a deficit thinking mindset, so that there's gaps in local communities and with local organizations, and therefore it's our job to fill those gaps. That's not what we're saying here. What we're saying is that we have to recognize that there might be opportunities for us to be able to share our learning, but again, we need to do that sensitively and thoughtfully. The final thing to say about this is that actually co-learning is a really important aspect of learning that came out of the conversations we've had with our partners. Co-learning is that we learn together. We agree a joint learning agenda. So, for example, at Peace Direct, we have learning questions that we agree with each of our partners, and they are more important than any monitoring and evaluation that we do. It's what are we going to learn together? Not that they're going to learn at our expense or we're going to learn and not involve them. What are we going to learn together? And so we create this joint learning agenda with learning questions. So I'd encourage you to think about that. And really try and practice that with your partners. Moving on, convener. So we know that the projectized way of working means that funding goes to local actors for short-term projects. Very little time is available for local actors to reflect, and even less time is available for them to meet and connect with others. We tend as INGOs not to fund that. We don't include that in project proposals, and we don't therefore support that work. And what we know is, and from Peace Direct's experience of being a convener for 20 years, is that when you put local actors or any civil society actors together, magic happens. You just give them the space to strategize, to reflect, to share ideas, to share challenges together. And it is really, really precious. It's absolutely precious for local actors to have that time. And so we call them peace exchanges because we're a peace building organization. You could call them practitioner workshops. But one of the most important things about this is that you're not just bringing your partners together. The idea is, how can you strengthen the ecosystem? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's about how you support local actors, even those who are not your partners, to come together, to learn and to strategize. So my question to you all is, how often have you built in opportunities for your partners to learn and reflect not only with each other, but also with their peers in country. We know it's highly valued and we're being asked to do more of it. And I imagine that would be the same for every INGO. If we did more of it, I think it would be hugely valuable. So let's talk about the ecosystem. So we talk at Peace Direct about this vibrant, dynamic civil society ecosystem that is in every country. And if you think about any country in the global south or majority world, it's dynamic. There's thousands of them, different types of organizations, women's groups, youth groups, CBOs, NGOs, one's based in the capital, one's based in the countryside. But what we do know is that it's very fragmented. That ecosystem, if you take that as a whole, it's very fragmented. And we talk about two types of fragmentation. We talk about horizontal fragmentation. So that's the fragmentation that happens between local organizations at the grassroots level, even in the same village, but sometimes it's between villages. And what that means is that they don't have the opportunity to connect because the road infrastructure is not good, because they don't have vehicles, they don't have the funding to travel, they don't have the time or space to do that. And so what that means is that they aren't able to share learning between other grassroots organizations in their context, in their region or their sub-region or their district. And then there's vertical fragmentation, which is the fragmentation that happens in civil society between those at the grassroots and then those that are in the cities. And again, it's people talk about the center and periphery, or the sort of elites and the grassroots, but whatever you want to call it, the civil society ecosystem is fragmented that way. So the grassroots actors don't often have the chance to go to the capital city and to engage in discussions that are taking place there. Meanwhile, the organizations that are based in the capital city don't travel enough to the areas in the countryside. So that fragmentation weakens the health of the civil society ecosystem. So what can we do? We can be the connective tissue, the glue that actually helps bridge some of those gaps. What does that look like? It means that you fund the ecosystem and you support the ecosystem. It means you convene more. It means you find ways to connect, actually physically say, okay, I think this organization would love to meet this organization and make the introduction. It means that INGOs map what the ecosystem looks like in each country and starts to identify how those organizations could support each other, could work with each other. So when we've done that, and we've taken a very deliberate ecosystem strengthening approach at Peace Direct, we see incredible things happening, because again, when you start to map the different actors and you provide opportunities to connect between those actors, they start to see commonalities in their experience and they start to do work together. Sometimes, not always, sometimes there's competition, and sometimes they would prefer to work on without having to work with others, but that's fine too. But where there's opportunities for joint work, joint strategizing, let's capitalize on that and let's strengthen that health, the health of the ecosystem itself. So I'd ask you to think about whether you do that in your work. This is a very well-established role. So the role of the advocate and amplifier. So most of us know an organization that does that. And I'm sure some of you or all of you probably do that in your own roles already. We hear time and time again from Global South Civil Society, it's really, really valued. They recognize that we have power and positionality and that we should be using that in the spaces and the places that we are in. So I am in London. I can use that proximity to power and proximity to decision makers in London to advocate on behalf of my partners. And actually what tends to happen with INGOs is that they advocate for issues, but they don't advocate for partners. In other words, they will advocate for a cause, but they won't necessarily promote their partners because they feel that they should be promoting themselves. So actually, we've got to find a way of being better advocates for our partners and the issues that they represent, and not just the issue. It also includes campaigning and creating space for Global South partners to lead. So, for example, at Peace Direct, we just provide opportunities for our partners to come and do it themselves, whether it's in London or whether it's New York to the UN, but that's important. And finally, it's really important that we educate our own public. if there's a role that we have, it's to advocate to our own governments and educate our own public. And we've got to do more of that, because particularly at a time when there's a surge in right-wing populism across various countries, we've got to be able to educate the public, to tell them the value of solidarity and the value of international cooperation, because people care. But we haven't done a good enough job as INGOs of doing that, because we've become part of this project machine. So we've really got to work harder at that. So even if you're not an advocacy organization, you've got to think about how you can advocate better for your partners. Only a few more, and then we can wrap up and open up a conversation. So this is linked very much to the last one, but this is more specific about being a watchdog. We know that civil society and civic space is closing around the world. If you read the Civicus reports, the state of civil society, just over 2% of the world's population live in contexts that are classed as completely free. So, where freedom of expression is completely allowed, and where freedom of peaceful assembly is allowed. That means that the rest of the world is in either restricted spaces or completely closed spaces. So what do we need to do? As INGOs, we need to play a watchdog role, because we have power and access to policymakers, decision makers, public, the media. We should be using that to be a watchdog on behalf of our partners who are at risk. So many people know organizations like Civicus or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, but it doesn't need to be those human rights focused organizations. All of us can play a watchdog role. It doesn't have to be a public one, but we can do that discreetly. So we have done it very, very discreetly by talking to various embassies if we're worried about civic space, or we're worried about partners' safety and security. So just because you're not a watchdog or you're not a human rights organization doesn't mean you can't do this. So I would ask you to consider, to what extent are you actually prepared to play that role, to actually act as a watchdog, and to try and lean into the power that you might have and the access that you might have to protect civil society. So we're now down to the last two. Critical friend is really one of just, and it is a very, very neglected role. And part of the reason it's so neglected is that the sector currently operates where INGOs either implement or INGOs grant manage, and then they have to supervise, for want of a better phrase, local organizations to do the work, and local organizations report to INGOs. It's a fundamentally flawed model. It should have been finished years ago, decades ago. But what that means is that INGOs aren't very good critical friends, because they've in effect become contractors or subcontractors. And so what we're talking about here is actually being a sounding board for your partner, actually walking with them and offering advice when it's asked for, and also trying to problem solve solutions. So it's, a critical friend is not one that sees a local partner as a subcontractor and that they're just to deliver services and then to report to you. It really is understanding that actually good international cooperation is fundamentally about relationships, and it's a relational issue. So we have to think about forging really strong relationships and really equitable partnerships. In fact, that, the last talk I gave to the pledge community was all about that. That enables you to be a critical friend. And the critical point of that is important, because it's not just about not challenging our partners if we disagree with them. They want that challenge. They just don't want the current totally distorted power relations that they have right now. So what we've noticed is that the existing policies, practices, and culture of INGOs really limits the opportunity for INGOs to act as a genuine critical friend. So it does require a culture change piece to happen. It's not something that can just happen overnight. It's about how we understand our role in the sector. And that leads me nicely to the last one, which is all about being a sidekick. Now, this is more of I would argue this is much more of a philosophical role. It's about the philosophy of cooperation. It's about the philosophy of international aid and development. It's about where do we see ourselves? And so it's a quite deep, very difficult role that we have to transition into. We have got to stop thinking of ourselves as being in the driving seat. That's the way I describe it. We have to we have to sit in the passenger seat now, and that local actors have to be in the driving seat, and it's our role to be their sidekick. We're going on this journey together. When we hold these consultations with Global South actors, they say, we want your solidarity, we want your partnership. So there's very little talk of we want you kicked out of our country, all of you. We actually want your solidarity and your partnership, but we want it to look different. And that's really about this state of mind. So thinking about how we become much more humble, we stop doing roles that we have done for years. We start to be their support team. We call ourselves a sidekick and a support team. Yesterday I was talking to a donor and they asked us about our expertise, and I said we don't have the expertise. Our partners have the expertise. And I could see the look of confusion on the donor's face, because we're so accustomed as INGOs to saying that we have the expertise and we know best. Well, actually, I think we have to fundamentally reset that and think actually local partners are in the driving seat. It is their community and it is their country after all. So let's think about ourselves as sidekicks. So what practices inhibit you from being a really effective sidekick? And the final slide is just a general health warning. So when we wrote this report and published it 2 years ago. The purpose of this was to emphasize that even in a world where INGOs are no longer implementing and are no longer grant managing, there are still really useful roles that we can play. Now, we're not in that world right now. INGOs still do a lot of implementation and they still do a lot of grant management. But what we were saying is there are roles that are useful as INGOs start to transition and think about their different roles. But some of those roles are still temporary. In a perfect world, those roles wouldn't exist. So these 9 roles are not permanent roles for INGOs. They are designed, as it says here, to plug holes in a system that doesn't work for local actors. So some interpreter or knowledge broker or convener, potentially those may not be necessary in the future if there's more investment in local agency, local dignity, local efforts. But there are others that will absolutely be vital well into the future: the advocate, the watchdog, the critical friend. So, this is an opportunity for us as INGOs, and I've spent my whole life working for INGOs, big and small, that we use this crisis moment as an opportunity to really think about how many of these roles do we do already? Because I suspect that on this call, most of you do some of these roles, and some of your organizations might do all of them. So let's just think about how we can lean into some of those roles, but also recognize some of those are still temporary, and that this is a journey of transformation that hopefully will lead to much stronger leadership from Global South and Majority World partners, and that we will be there in the passenger seat as part of that journey. Thank you.
Isabella, I think you're muted.
Isabella, yeah, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you. Thanks, Dylan. I was just saying how incredibly powerful the resource is 2 years since its publication, because as you mentioned, it is even more timely than ever, I feel, in the moment that we're in right now. And I see it being mentioned, referenced quite a bit in the Shift to Power movement conversations. It just keeps popping up in so many discussions, and I'm glad that it's getting the attention that it did get the attention when it was first published, but even more so now. And I really appreciate this summary version. I do hope that those of you who haven't seen the full resource will get to read it cover to cover. I posted the link in the chat. I just wanted to kick off with one question and then open up for discussion in a plenary for everyone. I just feel that the question of relationship building is an important one here as well, with the health warning in mind at the end of your presentation in terms of some of these roles being temporary. I also know that a lot of the partnerships in the past that INGOs had established were treated as very transactional, right? And they became a mechanism for channeling funds, channeling programmatic and values and kind of concepts and so on, those inputs, programmatic inputs of a particular kind. And we know that really meaningful partnerships and equitable partnerships require relationships, that requires time, and less of a mechanistic approach. And in the process of it, of all the roles that you mentioned, I'm thinking of all the roles that we don't want to see more, like gatekeepers and middlemen and all of those ways that the aid sector has struggled with. So it is a question about what does it take to establish some of these roles, to do this in a humble and genuine way that actually brings value to local partners beyond being seen as that transactional, temporary cog in a chain, as some have felt, being used. And how do you see that transitioning, especially in a moment that we're in right now? Where do you see organizations already taking early steps, or maybe not so early? Perhaps some have already been making their inroads in transitioning to these new roles, and how long it takes, and how do you maintain that? I think that's a question that I'm asking also, not only from the INGO point of view, but also from philanthropic point of view. A lot of philanthropies are struggling with similar questions. Yeah, over to you. Thanks, Dylan.
Thanks, Isabella. I mean, yeah, it's a great question. There's a few questions in there. I think the first one is, how do you do that transition? I mean, the first and I guess most fundamental point is that you've got to recognize that the current operating model is wrong. Now, that sounds like an obvious point for us on this call, but actually, when you look at most INGO strategies, and this is the point that's been raised with me many times, is that most INGO strategies are still predicated on the notion of growth. That actually INGOs should grow and get bigger and do more and expand their footprint. Now, if that's the case, then actually they don't think that there's anything wrong with their current model. They just want to do more of it. And what we're saying is you've got to fundamentally challenge your assumptions about your value add in the world and your role in the world. If you don't do that, nothing can change. And so this actually does start from the top. This starts from the board, and it starts from a board culture that says, are we sense checking why what are we here to do and why do we exist? Are we trying to do ourselves out of a job? How many times have we heard that? And no one has actually done themselves out of a job because we've found reasons to exist and to actually do more, scale up. So I think there really does need to be a very deep piece of work that's done with the board and also with our organizational strategies. Because our strategies force our organizations to continue doing the work, and our success criteria are based on income. It's unbelievably corporate. We measure our success by how much money we've brought in, because that's a proxy for reach and power and influence and the number of communities that we've helped. But actually, all we're doing is we're maintaining the status quo. We're not actually changing or transforming at all. So it has to start there. But what I can say is that I have had conversations over the last 5 years now with INGOs, well over 100 INGOs now. Their progress is happening. That pledge is happening. I mean, the pledge community is a really good example of that, where there's a commitment to changing thinking and practice. And we've also heard that it's not just, don't just jump to the practice. Actually look at the mindsets and the worldviews and the values. And that's what we keep coming back to. And it sounds a bit abstract, but it isn't. It's about saying, do we still think of ourselves as the experts in everything? Do we still have the ways of working which talk down to other actors and say that they lack expertise and experience and we know best? So we keep reminding ourselves that some of this work is deep kind of inner work and looking at values and looking at individual values and organizational values. And do we really live the values that we talk about all the time, about participation and inclusion and equity? Because we don't practice that in the relationships that we have with our partners, because then it becomes very commercial. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and that needs to happen at a senior level, but of course throughout the whole organization. Even if there are no senior leaders in this call, you can still do it in your department, in your unit, in your area of work. And I would say also that I've been really encouraged before this funding crisis. I've been really encouraged that I've spoken to INGOs who have said, we are going to transition out of some of our roles. In the UK, some of the big multi-mandate INGOs have said, we are going to transition out of some of our roles over time. It's going to take time. And of course, I guess one of the examples of how not to do things is what's happened with USAID. Even if they might have been very flawed in some of how their practices in terms of funding, you would never stop something overnight. And the same with INGOs. We're not saying you transform yourself tomorrow, because the transformation has to take time and to be done thoughtfully and respectfully. and does require the whole organization to really feel those values. And you know, I'm seeing it happen. And the reality is that we have little choice, because I think that these conversations are being had by Global South majority world actors all the time now. They're waiting patiently for this to happen. There will be a point where patience will run out, and they'll say, well, where's the progress, folks? Where you said you would change. And the same challenge, of course, is to pledge members as well. So we'll have to see. But I'm encouraged by what I see. I think there's a risk in what's happening right now. So maybe the last point to say is, and Shane's asked the question in the chat about this, you've got this current crisis moment. I think the crisis should be an opportunity for transformation. But what tends to happen is that we just then sort of retreat inwards, and we say, right, we've got to protect our own. We've got to protect our own organization. We've got to protect our staff. We've got to figure out how we manage this. And in doing that, we're actually then being a barrier to the change, rather than saying, okay, this is a terrible situation we're all in. Everyone's lost funding. How can we use this as a way of actually repositioning ourselves to be an ally, rather than in being a dominant player in a particular country that takes up all the space? So I do think it should be an opportunity, but I haven't seen people use it yet. I still think we're probably too early on in the crisis for people to think creatively. They're just sort of dealing with the crisis. So more work to be done, but I do think we shouldn't squander this crisis, squander this opportunity, right? Because it is an opportunity for change.
Agree. Thank you, Dylan. Yes, there is a tendency to go insular and to go into self-preservation mode. And I hope that we don't see too much of that. And you're right, there are things to celebrate. And it is a testament that a lot of the CEOs who were at the table when Pledge for Change discussions began were UK-based CEOs. And I just want to acknowledge that, which reflects, you know, your experience and your discussions. Let me make sure that you answered Shane's question. Shane, do you want to come on off mic and ask the question directly? I also just want to acknowledge that Shane, as the co-chair of the Equitable Partnership Working Group, was one of the thought partners on getting the learning agenda started. And these are the first few sessions of that learning agenda. So Shane, you're welcome to come off mic if you would like.
Thanks, Isabella. I won't come on camera. Sorry, I'm in a car at the moment, which is why I had to type. I think Dylan's answer was really on point, and for me, captures the imperative that we have to collectively seize the moment to catalyze this critical change. So I'll also just take the opportunity to say a huge thanks to Dylan. This is such inspiring work. Really appreciate your time today. So thanks, Isabella.
Thanks, Shane. Natalie, would you like to come in with your observation that you posted in the chat on the sidekick roles?
Thanks, Isabella. Thanks, Dylan. Great to get a reminder on that research. I saw it at the time, but it feels so relevant given where so many NGOs are with funding at the moment. So I was kind of agreeing with a couple of the things you said, particularly this sense that INGOs need to have this sense of themselves being sidekicks. But my observation is that lots of the people that I come into contact with through my different hats in the sector, that they're not fully convinced that the sector will thrive and do better or even maintain what we do now with INGOs in that sidekick role. It is the deep learning or unlearning that needs to bring that mind shift change. But my experience is it's very time consuming. It takes time for staff to unlearn, to think about new positions. It's strategy development time with boards. It's educating boards. It's educating, you know, the very senior elite in the organisation, because it's often others in the organisation that have these perspectives. And I'm just worried that when money is tight, tighter than it's ever been in a long time, you know, how will we continue unlearning and get this mind shift change still happening when people are feeling so pressured about income, pressured about keeping their jobs, let alone pivoting?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, Natalie. So the first thing to say is I think you're absolutely right that there are people that aren't convinced. And I think there are two answers to that. One of which is that's part of the problem, right? They're not convinced because they still believe in the sort of the way in which the sector has developed. They've got very sort of neo-colonial, they would never say that, but neo-colonial kind of attitudes. We know best, and actually we should do this work because we know best. So that's a real symptom of the problem, that people still think that without them, these societies will be much worse off. And for me, that then goes back to question around purpose. What is our purpose here? If our purpose is simply to just deliver services, then maybe that they're right. Maybe it's just we deliver services. But if the purpose of the organization is to really ensure that those communities are self-reliant and those communities can support each other, and that we are building the health of the ecosystem of actors, local actors, to support each other, then actually we can't continue to say and justify our position in the way that we have. There's a slightly more unpalatable answer to your question, which I want to just be honest about, and that is, if we were to stop all the funding overnight, things would be worse off immediately. The reality is that we have, and I said this in my first slide, we have intentionally or otherwise completely suppressed the growth of civil society and the dynamism of civil society, because we have taken 93% of the funding. I mean, 93% of all funding for CSOs goes to INGOs. So they are starved of funds. So let's not blame them, and let's not say that they are able to scale up in the same way as one of the big multi-mandate INGOs, because they've never had the opportunity. So there is a reality check here that actually, if we were to turn off the taps and close up shop overnight, there would be pain in the same way as we've just seen with USAID. So what we are talking about is a transition, a responsible and respectful transition. And really making sure that that funding that does then get channeled to civil society really strengthens them rather than weakens them. If you currently transfer the funds from the EU, for example, directly to local organizations, it would kill them, because EU funding is terrible funding. It's poor quality funding with lots of bureaucracy and due diligence. So it is a process. And the second point of your second part of your question was around the unlearning. I think it's extremely difficult to do right now, Natalie. I do think that's a fair point, and I'm not making excuses for INGOs, because I think that we still have to do it, and we all have to do it. By the way, global South actors, majority world actors, are also trying to do it, because suddenly the funding has been cut from them, because it's the trickle down effect in terms of that USAID funding and others and European funding. But we can't keep using that as an excuse. If we continue to use "it's really hard out there and there's a crisis" as a reason not to think creatively, we can use that excuse forever, because there's always another excuse, right? This is a cataclysmic event, but we have had cataclysmic events in the past. We had COVID, and in between COVID and now, and well into the future, there's also conflicts and there's also other things happening. We can always find an excuse not to do the deep learning and the unlearning and the reflection. And we're going to have to say to ourselves, we're just going to have to do it. And we're going to have to commit some time to it and reserve some of our time to do that. And that, again, requires a bit of senior leader buy-in in this, because otherwise, what I don't want the message to be, we have to suddenly do 50-hour weeks or 70-hour weeks or 100-hour weeks because we then want to do the unlearning. We've got to have to find some time to carve out some time, which is quality time, for us to say, are we doing the right thing here? Are we just on the treadmill? And I think Pledge has done a lot of that in the early years with Degan and the CEOs, and I'm sure that they do it right now. But we need more of it. What about the people outside of Pledge? How do they get involved in this? How do they, this becomes a sector-wide approach? So there's definitely more work that needs to be done, but we can't keep using the "it's really hard and really difficult out there" excuse, which I think you're right, people are using, because it's a crisis, yes, but that is the moment for a pivot, is the moment for reflection, a radical reflection of what we're supposed to be doing.
It was really interesting thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. Pooji, you had your hand up earlier, and I'm sorry if I missed it. Please come in with your question.
No, thank you, Dylan. This is Puji from Indonesia. Appreciate your sharing and reflection from the study. It's really, really informative. As you say, the crisis, the change is happening right now. I think a big chunk of the money is disappearing from the 93% that you mentioned. And let's take note, none of the money goes to the South. This just evaporates. We in the South learned during the pandemic that when the thing hits the fan, the NGOs retreated. And we were left to defend ourselves on our devices. This is not long ago, just very recent. And the bad taste is still here with us. Now with whatever is left on us, if there is any, on our own devices, in a vehicle that may no longer look like a car, you will see, and yes, you predict, Dylan, colleagues from NGO will no longer on the driving seat. They have been spelling the word localization more often. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with the UN team in Jakarta. The word localization tastes like disengagement. It tastes like downscaling. It tastes like abandonment. That's the new connotation of localization. Now, going back to the analogy of the vehicle that you used earlier, SINGO is no longer in the driving seat. The money is no longer there. You said that the INGOs will be on the passenger seat. What role are you going to play in that passenger seat? If we look at the 9 roles that you presented and do a little bit of gymnastic of that, we could actually imagine what the intermediary roles will transform to when the NGOs is on the passenger seat and the vehicle is no longer Land Rover. It will be a donkey cart. What, instead of adding to the burden that we are dragging, what is it that you're gonna do? Apology for the provocation, Dylan and Isabella. Over to you. Thank you.
I loved it, and I loved your analogy. I think it's great. Yeah, maybe it isn't a car. Maybe it's a tandem bicycle, and we're behind. You know, I don't know what the right analogy is, but you're right. There's not, you know, there will be less money. But that's, for me, I think the most important question that INGO should be asking in this new sector is, of their partners, is what role do you want us to play? I mean, we don't even ask that question. What we tend to say is we're going to do this, we're going to do A, B, and C, we're going to do some service delivery, and then we'll find an implementing partner to do this. What we're trying to say is, actually, you could just ask. You ask your partners, you ask civil society, what role do you think is useful for us? And if the answer is actually there's no useful role for you, then we should listen to that and actually exit. But if they say, actually, it's really helpful if you could be our, you know, watchdog or our advocate in New York or in London, because we need that, they might say, actually, we'd like to do the ecosystem strengthening, but you could do some of the convening because you might be able to convene in ways that we can't convene. That's possible too. So I think we've just got to be open to actually listening to some harsh feedback from the communities and the organizations that we're supposed to be supporting. The question that you mentioned about localization, I don't use the word localization. I've sort of banned it within Peace Direct. I've never enjoyed it. I've never liked it. I think it's we've written a paper on it, which I can try and dig out and put in the link. But the problem of localization, it is an imported term, and it is I think a real problematic term. We're talking about investing in just local leadership, investing in local civil society is what we're talking about. So yes, I can see that some people are distorting localization. They're distorting it in a number of ways. You just described one. You said localization looks like abandonment. A worse, more pernicious form of localization is where INGOs are actually repositioning themselves as truly local organizations to then compete with local organizations for funding. And I know there are organizations that are experiencing that. Local organizations are saying to me, this INGO is now saying that they are truly local, and now they're sweeping up all the funding that's available in country, including doing local fundraising. And that's a way of killing local civil society as well. So I think that we've got to be really honest about, are we in this for the right reasons? Because what you're describing is that some NGOs are just so committed to their own self-preservation and their own identity in those countries that they can't imagine exiting. The final thing to say about what you mentioned was, I do, what role will we play? We have asked our partners that. We have asked our partners whether we should be present in certain places. I mean, when I say present, still supporting. And they said right now, civil society is still, needing support and is still fragmented. So there are still opportunities for us to add value. But the most important thing is we're asking the question. If you don't ask the question, you'll never get an honest answer. And you may not. It's difficult to get an honest answer sometimes, but we got to ask that question. Yes, it's a difficult time right now. It's a hugely difficult time, but I still, go back to my earlier point. INGOs, if we do this badly, I can see what's going to happen. INGOs will then try and entrench themselves and just take up the last bits of funding that are whatever's left of the funding will go to INGOs. We can't as actors let that happen, because that will weaken civil society even further. So I think we all have a responsibility to call it out when we see it. And there are people who do that. Isabella, there's lots of questions in the chat.
There was a question from Alex Tiernan, but she's stepping off. You could still answer it, Dylan, because I think it's a relevant question. I'll read it out.
Yeah, or maybe I'm actually still here, so maybe I'll just very quickly and then leave you to enjoy the answer, because I won't have time for the answer. But I was just wondering, so an organization like Christian Aid gets funding from people in the global north who really do want to make a positive difference, and we are, so to speak, their channel. Do you feel that we as INGOs no longer have that as a legitimate channel? Or as a legitimate role? Should we completely say, no, you guys in the churches just have to send your money straight to the local actors, which is obviously an offer. It's possible, especially if, and this is something that I've been thinking about a little bit, this role of intermediary that between donor and let's say various local actors gets taken up by a national level intermediary. It's very possible that national level intermediaries will actually become the middleman.
Yeah.
In order to facilitate all the funding flows and to avoid donors having to work with a lot of different actors, which they don't want to do or don't have capacity to do. But there it is. That's my question. Is there no role at all for INGOs to be conduits of relatively benign, let's say, non-institutional, flexible and core, I should say, funding that we could manage it on a very different level than, let's say, a donor funding would be managed, i.e. in terms of within a equitable partnership approach?
Yeah,
but I'll have to leave you there, and thank you so much.
Sorry, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. We'll share the recording, so you'll get to hear Dylan's response.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. I know you have to run. Thanks.
Look, the short answer is I do think that there is a role, because solidarity matters. And solidarity can take very, many different forms. And one of them is that a person giving to a person giving their £10 or $10 a month. I think that is a sign of solidarity and care and compassion. I think that, but there's some health warnings, I suppose, attached to it. That's the thing I would say. So I think there'll always be a role if the churches want to give, or the congregation wants to give and do a collection and wants to give it to Christian Aid. I think that I don't see any problem with that personally, but I do think that there's a couple of things that we need to consider. One is, are we educating our public and our constituencies? Are we actually educating them so that they understand the role that Christian Aid plays versus the role that local organizations? Are we inflating our role as experts at the expense of local organizations? Are we really doing a good enough job of explaining that we're no longer, the white saviors, which is where we've positioned ourselves as INGOs for decades and decades? So are we doing that hard work because it's uncomfortable? Or are we reinforcing old tropes because it actually, tugs on the sympathies and the heartstrings of people? So I think we need to do that education piece. And the second thing is, are we making sure that that funding then goes without any strings attached to local organizations? So are we then making sure that we genuinely live those values by actually getting it to in a sort of solidarity based funding to local organizations, or are we then imposing our own restrictions? I've heard from multiple local organizations that they've heard from donors that the donor gives the money to the INGO with few strings attached, and the INGO adds additional strings because they have their own internal processes and compliance and due diligence. So then you get the worst of all worlds, is where an initial flexible bit of funding becomes even more inflexible because it's gone through an intermediary. So I think we've got to do some work there. And the final thing to say is about, are we replacing one type of intermediary with another? Yeah, we are, in a sense. I mean, we are basically saying that there will be, at some point, we're going to see a transition where the INGOs become smaller and that local organizations and national based organizations become bigger. And I think that's no bad thing, so long as those national organizations are genuinely locally grounded, locally owned, locally rooted, and that they are in service of their communities. Now, we all know you get national organizations that are just the elites and don't represent their constituencies meaningfully. So we've also got to be very careful that we're not just replicating and creating mini INGOs in the capital city. I call them the usual suspects. And actually what we've got to do, and something that Peace Direct does a lot of, is mapping the diversity of actors and recognizing that the INGOs should not just identify the usual suspects in the capital city, because they can be an impediment to the growth and diversity of civil society, because they've actually grown in a way that actually benefits them and not necessarily others. But we want to build a healthy ecosystem of civil society actors that can help their own communities. So we need to do more mapping of that. But I think that's entirely possible. If a small organization of Peace Direct size can do it, then anyone can do it. And Alex also asked in the chat, where do we get our funding from? I mean, most of our funding unusually is from private philanthropy, and we've spent years and years persuading them to become more flexible and more trust-based in their approach. But it's taken years. I did some analysis recently, and something like about 85% of all of our grants from foundations are flexible, trust-based grants, which means that we can be flexible and trust-based to our partners, because we don't have to worry about the ridiculous onerous requirements. But that's another role that we can play as INGOs. We should be pushing back to donors to say, this is terrible practice, donors. We don't do that because we don't want to lose their funding. We've written letters to donors to say, we're not taking your money anymore because it's rubbish, poor quality funding. How many of us have done that in the room? We've got to be able to say no to funding if it's poor quality. And that's, again, using one of our roles as an advocate, and to say, look, this is not useful funding to local actors. Change your practice. And you know what? Sometimes they walk away, sometimes they change their practice, but we'll never know if we don't ask them. So we've got to do more of that.
Thank you, Dylan. And we'll make sure to share your response with Alex. So Danshu is asking in the chat if anything is new about this financial crisis. After all, some of the previous efforts to reform the system, WHS included, were in response to funding cuts and the layoffs that major organizations had started way before this most recent events. So Danshu, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. Feel free to come in.
Thank you. And Dylan, it's always so nice listening to you. You're so knowledgeable and committed. No, yeah, no, this is what I was wondering. No, that the same problems we have been discussing forever, and to address the same set of problems, a process is invented, and we spend time and energy and resources on that process without solving that. So what is new? and again, now we are talking about humanitarian reset, and perhaps new jargons will come up, new mechanism will come up. Um what is going to change? But uh, so, Matthew, Dylan, what is the pragmatic solution? My opinion is that it's time for Southern actors to acquire their ideological independence uh, and start working on their own mechanism. But we also have a problem of just expecting the North to change themselves for us, which is not going to happen. No. So, what is your opinion on that, Dylan?
Thanks, Sudhanshu. Great to talk to you as always. Well, look, I think that there is a difference. I mean, so you've mentioned the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016 or 2015, whenever it was. I think there is a qualitative difference between that time and this time. If you have a look at the Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Society report that came out at the time, which was the kind of springboard, I suppose, to some of the conversations around localization, that was basically saying, you know, local actors are at the front lines, and it was really using a kind of efficiency and effectiveness argument. It was saying they are there. Let's use them more because they actually don't have a lot of money. A lot of the money doesn't go. So I think the framing around the time of the World Humanitarian Summit wasn't just simply inadequate. The framing was all about efficiency and effectiveness. It wasn't about dignity, and it certainly wasn't about structural or systemic racism or power imbalances. And so what you then had from the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain was something that was trying to fix a problem by looking at one symptom, which was the funding and efficiency, when actually the bigger problem was that the money was being dominated because we had deeply problematic attitudes about our own roles and where we see our own expertise and the hierarchy of knowledge and all the things that, you know, I and others and you, Sudhanshu, talk about as well. So I think that this does feel different, because what happened from about 2021 onwards was people started to examine that, whereas they didn't examine that in 2015 and 2016. Now you cannot ignore problems of identity and power and race and the power imbalances. You know, those things are the most deep-seated problems, and those are surfaced all the time now. So you talked about sort of ideological independence. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there's about reclaiming the narrative and reclaiming a sense of kind of power and agency and dignity, which is happening through your organization and through others that I know are doing that. And that's exactly what is necessary, and being vocal. Because what we're seeing is that actually it doesn't take many, you know, majority world or global south actors to be vocal for it to then give other people the confidence to be vocal. But for years and years, global south actors weren't vocal because they were terrified of losing funding. But now, where's the funding? There's not lots of funding. So be vocal. Don't be afraid of it. And actually, you've got allies, you know, not just Peace Direct, but other allies, I'm sure, in Pledge and elsewhere. So I think the tide is turning. I think it does feel different. But, you know, with every crisis, you know, we lost that opportunity during COVID. As I think the previous speaker, Puji from Indonesia, said, you know, we were here before. We did this in COVID, and guess what happened? You know, all the local actors did all the work, and then when COVID finished and all the movement restrictions were lifted, INGOs went back to business as usual. So we could squander this opportunity. INGOs could go back to business as usual. It may not be now, but it could be in a few years' time. Let's imagine for a moment, USAID gets reconstituted under the next democratic president, if there is one. And let's imagine that the right-wing governments across Europe start to give funding. What's going to happen then? Will INGOs just rush? It'll be a gold rush again, and INGOs will then rush for that money? Or will we have learned something? And I'm hoping that one of the lessons that at least global south actors will have learned is not to rely on global north. Is not, you know, the hypocrisy of the values that we say the global north has. You know, it's a bit superficial, isn't it? I mean, we can see that. So I hope that this is a moment for changing, but time will tell. I still worry about it, Sudhanshu. I worry that all of this change agenda could still collapse because we run out of energy, we feel too tired, we're dealing with our own crises, we're burnt out, and we just keep on delivering. And then the history books, I think, will look back and say, why on earth did we continue to do that for so long? I think that's what's going to happen. When the history books are written about the INGO sector, they'll say, we tried to do good, we did harm in the process, we weren't aware of that harm for some time, but even when we were aware of that harm, we didn't change. And that's, I really hope that that's not the history that will be written about the role of the INGO.
I hope so too, Dylan. And yet, there are already books that have captured some of that, some of the trials and tribulations and the harm, obviously, that has been caused by misguided theories about how change happens or really poor decision making. There's a question in the chat from Barry on how broad your definition of INGOs is. Does it include, for example, all bond members, big and small, private foundations, and other philanthropic organizations, social entrepreneurship, funders, professional associations, trade union, as well as solidarity, membership-based, and activist organizations, as well as Global South originating large international organizations like BRAC. Just asking, as your characterization of INGOs seem particularly focused on the most prominent big INGOs and federations?
Well, in that list, Barry, I would say that when we think about INGOs or talk about INGOs, we aren't just talking about the large multi-mandate INGOs, not at all. In fact, actually, I've heard some very interesting progressive thinking coming out of some of those big INGOs, and some very backward, frankly, thinking coming out of the smaller INGOs, so smaller bond members, because they were set up from a founder who visited a country, fell in love with it, and thought they would help, and actually are starting to sort of repeat some of the colonial practices that we're criticizing. So it doesn't include just big INGOs. But it does include any INGO that has any form of presence overseas, which and non-profit organization that has a presence overseas. Does it include funders, social entrepreneurship funders, professional associations? I'm not sure. I mean, I really don't know, because I don't know enough about how they operate. I know how the non-profit sort of charity sector works, both in the UK, the US, and Europe. So I can say with confidence that it covers them. Whether it covers some of these others, I'm not sure, because I think that they operate slightly differently. But there are. I mean, we're going to be releasing a report on decolonizing philanthropy very shortly, which we did with the Decolonizing Wealth Project. And so we do know that philanthropy is a problem too. There's real problems with philanthropy, and so there are some common issues that relate to both INGO practice and private philanthropy as well. But certainly some of the others, you would know better than me, trade union funders, for example, and others. I think they probably have better models around solidarity, people to people giving, and also relationships that aren't based on just funding, are genuinely based on solidarity and just standing with others. So I would say it only partially covers the list.
Barry,
Yeah,
come in if you have a follow-up.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, great. And thanks a million, Dylan. I appreciate a lot of what you said. I think those 9 rules are really helpful for us to think about the way that that all kinds of international NGOs work. It's just so my intention not to be nitpicking, but sometimes sometimes it's not always confusing or not always clear who we are all talking about at the same time, because clearly a lot of the dynamics that you're talking about, don't just relate to international NGOs in a kind of like narrow band definition. They can and do affect all of the international actors and northern-based actors in the development system, particularly the official donors who do as much or more than anyone else to shape the system we're trying to change. So it's really just not to undermine what you're saying, but rather to say we both know that civil society is a really complex animal, north, south, east, and west. So when we trade in generalizations, sometimes we might be kind of, I don't know, inadvertently alienating those we would wish to persuade. And I worry a little bit about using terms like sidekick. That's one small concern, which is often taken in a sort of pejorative sense, not in the more positive philosophical way that you framed it. So, I mean, again, it just seems to me, is there a way of being, without toning down the critique, with giving a bit of a more of an opening to a whole range of organizations to own this conversation?
Yes, I think you're probably right. There is. I mean, we wanted to keep our report short because we also recognize that, you know, the sector produces lovely 60-page reports that no one reads. So we were very deliberate about the length of our report, and therefore the analysis is very, very short. You can read the report in 5 minutes. And that was a very deliberate strategy. But the problem, of course, the consequences that is that you miss some nuance, right? And that's what you're saying. When the question about alienation, though, I think that this is uncomfortable. And actually, I'm sort of unapologetic about that, because I think we have to have an uncomfortable conversation about our power and actually how we have grown as at least a certain type of INGOs have grown. And it is if we can't acknowledge that, then there is a problem. I'm not suggesting, by the way, you're not acknowledging it. I just think that what I'm saying is I think that there will be discomfort. And that's part of the process. If there's no pain and discomfort, then we're doing something wrong. I actually can't think that the sector can transform itself without pain and discomfort. And so that's just the, you know, unavoidable. The bigger you are, the more painful it will be. And so, you know, I don't know who's on the call, but, you know, the biggest of the INGOs are going to experience the most pain, because they built up for decades a sort of sense of identity that now is being basically challenged, quite rightly. But yes to the nuance, and yes to bringing other people into the conversation, and yes to not painting all INGOs in the same light or with the same brush, and certainly yes to the idea that actually some of those other groups that you mentioned there could operate very differently and could show different models of cooperation that we could learn from.
Thank you, Dylan. And I think it is helpful. There was a question earlier on terminology, and this is a really good question, Barry, that you asked in terms of what's included and in the terms that we're using here. It's just even in the INGO definition. The concern, I believe, for a lot of members in the Shift to Power movement and a lot of the supporters in the pledge community has been with INGOs that have country presence, extensive, you know, and continue to do direct implementation and open country offices. So Sudhanshu actually responded in a chat to Alex's earlier point, specifically noting that it's not so much where you raise your funds, and if this is Christian aid, so obviously raising funds from churches and individual donations is not the main problem. The problem is opening country offices, and this is what needs to stop. So I think so much of the 9 roles piece does, of course, apply to the larger organizations, whether they're federated or not. That doesn't necessarily matter, because Mercy Corps, IRC, others who have signed the pledge are not federated, but yet have country offices. But I do agree that it also applies, Dylan, as you said, to smaller organizations that still can step aside and, you know, retreat from certain spaces to allow more space, more agency, and more roles, more prominent roles or leadership roles to those that haven't been able to play those. So that's a really important distinction, I think. Natalie, you have your hand up. Please come in.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to share a little bit that has come out of the pledge work on authentic storytelling that speaks to this question from Barry around who do we mean when we say INGOs? And I think there's something useful to flag about how humanitarian development actors have developed terminology to do our work, and that terminology has concepts attached. So we've talked quite a lot to pledge signatories about this word international and the word local. and the fact that actually both words are words that are masquerading as geographical terms, similar to global north and global south. We present these terms as if they're just about geography and the places that people are in the world, when the reality is that the term conceptually is actually infused with issues around race, identity, and politics. And those are three big issues that the sector avoids. We avoid being political, talking about structural root causes. We avoid race and coloniality. And so we use these words and we present them as geographical terms. So, when we say international NGOs, really any NGO in the world, if they're big enough, if they, that they're kind of based in Kenya or Ethiopia or Nigeria, if they're big enough, they could be seen as an international organization. But often, if they're not based in a Western European country or North American country, they wouldn't be seen in that way. And so I think that there's something really interesting about how we use the word local as well. Anywhere is local. Some people have a local community no matter where you are in the world, but we use that word local to describe mainly Black and brown people working in the sector who are in a certain country, because we don't want to talk about race, identity, politics, etc. So I think that there's something about the terms we use, even the term sidekick. The term sidekick could be seen as appropriate because of the fact that actually we're in a sector that uses the word partnership as if our partnerships are all equal. So there's all these sins of inequality, structural racism, white supremacy that is actually hidden just by using the word partnership. And so we need to start to use words and language as decolonial tools, and tools that push and challenge and invite NGOs to really think about these issues. And so just using what could be seen as a provocative word like sidekick could actually be seen as a really useful way of using narrative and language as part of our kind of decolonial or anti-racist toolkit.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, look, completely agree. I mean, easy as that. I think language is hugely important, and language gets distorted and subverted for other people's purposes. And I think if you haven't had the chance to look at our partnerships report, do have a look at it, because I think that really talks about a lot of the issues that you just mentioned about the myth of partnerships, the myth of equitable partnerships. I also wanted to say, Isabella, to your point about the country offices, and I noticed in the chat they were talking about this. I am genuinely baffled, and maybe I'm naive here, genuinely baffled that there are still INGOs who are setting up country offices in the 21st century. It makes absolutely no sense at all. I have been, and I always will be, critical of those. If anyone is opening them now, that is madness. What we should be doing is looking at how our existing country offices are transitioned out of that operating model. It feels like the most antiquated, wrong-headed approach. I know it's hard. I'm not saying that this is easy for those who have had country offices for 50 years in a place, but that is part of the problem. And the thing is, I think you mentioned sort of, retreating. We can't really know how vibrant those societies will be and the ecosystem will be until we retreat, because our presence in itself affects the dynamics of the ecosystem. And that's, I remember 10 years ago, we were asked by one government donor, we were providing support in Eastern Congo to partners there. And they said, we would give you a lot more money if you just set up an office in Goma, because then we would trust you, because they wouldn't trust local actors. But that's the whole point. So people set up country offices because one group trusts that group over local organizations. So we refused to set up, we've never had a country office and we refused to set it up, and we didn't get any money. And that's okay. But the problem is that most responses to that, I imagine, from some big INGOs would have been, well, let's set up an office in Goma now to capitalize on that funding. So we've really also got to have some self-control here and stay true to the values that I actually believe the sector has. I just think that we've lost them along the way at various points, but we do deep down inside hold values of care and compassion and love and kindness and support and solidarity, and return to those and ask ourselves the question around whether or not what we're doing actually lives up to those values. It sounds very simple, doesn't it? It's not, obviously, because if it was, we would have done it by now. But I started my whole my journey as a in this sector with Oxfam. So I started with one of the biggest multi-mandate organizations, and I'm now with a small organization. I know that this stuff is hard to change, but we've got to give it our best shot. And I do think that the pressure that is coming from actors around the world, from other places, is really helpful, because it just reminds us that this is not just something that's been dreamt up by some organizations in the global north. It's what actually we've heard now for years from global south actors that they want, and that's getting louder. Fortunately, that those requests are no longer requests; they're sort of demands, which is good.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate your reminder, Dylan, to everyone on this call and to the Pledge community. I know others will be listening to the recording later to voice these demands more vocally, be more vocal, and continue to advocate and expect and demand these changes, because you are so right that the incentives are still there. They're quite perverse incentives to grow and to continue to expand that footprint. And in this moment of crisis that some organizations perhaps may be shrinking, maybe they're seeing it as a temporary thing, and that things will bounce back, a fear that you've expressed earlier. I think it's a real challenge working with leadership and boards on that particular narrative, right? That growth is not always equaling success, and that this is not the kind of transferring the corporate sector metrics of success into long-term process of development, which should be always locally led and locally facilitated as much as possible. It's an important conversation that a lot of organizations have started a long time ago. And I think Pledge Gathering last week, from what I heard from Kate and others, is a reminder that within institutions that continue maybe to show some status quo like behaviors, there are individuals fighting this battle inside these institutions. And we all have met these individuals. And as you said, it's unbelievable that country offices continue to be opened up. But I know, and I've spoken to so many people, senior humanitarian directors, who had to fight that battle inside their organizations when their CEO was calling them in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. because there was a Typhoon Haiyan happening or a tsunami or something somewhere, and asking, why are we not there already? Why are we not opening in the country office? Why are we not applying for the funds? Or staying longer to apply for funds that are being available to continue sort of recovery and post-disaster response. And those humanitarian directors fighting against their own leadership to take a smaller role and only help in emergency. So I think that continues behind the scenes. We don't always see it, and we need to support folks like that. And I do think the Pledge commitments, when they were being shaped, commitments to not do direct implementation by 2030, to in fact not impose stricter requirements on your partners that are being imposed on you. That's in the Pledge as well. All of this are informed by years of those internal conversations, some of which were successful, some were not. So I really hope that everyone in the community will continue to advocate for these changes. And Dylan, I hope that the resource is, met with renewed interest and is being applied and used in conversations internally, the 9 roles and all of the other pieces that Peace Direct put out, because people are still looking for what's next, right? And that's the kind of shaping that the future picture that the conversations happening again behind closed doors in the boardrooms and so on, hopefully are being informed by all the work that you've done and all of the consultations and all of the inputs that you've gathered from colleagues around the world. I really appreciate all of it. Any closing thoughts?
Just to say thank you. It's been a great conversation, and as you mentioned, I think we all have a responsibility to keep talking about this in our own spaces. Even if we don't see senior leadership doing what we want them to do, we can still have conversations with our own colleagues and within our own teams. So don't lose kind of hope if they're not gathering momentum in the way that you want to, because you still have agency and power within your own, your own domain. So to continue the conversation, don't let it go away, because we are all part of this and we all want a better sector. So I think we all have a bit of responsibility there to keep the conversation going and persuade others as well. Try to engage with others who don't agree with this, because we know those critiques, but we've still got to try and engage with them. We have to be able to have those conversations with them, because it does. While there is momentum growing, there's also spoilers. There are people who really don't want this to work. They want to have maintain the status quo, and that for us is just not. It's just ethically doesn't feel. It's the wrong century, and so let's stay true to that, and keep pushing. So thank you for the conversation, and nice that Natalie has brought someone to join the conversation as well.
Thank you, Dylan.
Thanks everyone. That was great.
And Barry is also reminding us in the chat that a lot of this work starts at home, solidarity and all the work on justice, development, and rights. And that just a reminder to INGOs that you too are civil society, and that's an important, just overarching role that I think INGOs need to reconnect with the origins of this all, not just contractors to government on development contracts,
exactly.
But civil society. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We'll be sharing the recording. We'll be sharing links to the resource yet again, and a summary of questions and responses from both sessions, actually, from the March and this one. Really appreciate all of you being here, all of the questions, and thanks, Dylan, again, for your time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.